initiative, really, to publish these books and also to publish something that they called the Syntopicon, which is the index to the great books. And what they were trying to do here was, in 2 volumes, sort of a little index to put together a reference of all of the ideas across these great works. So, here's Mortimer and his grad students. You can imagine, being a grad student working on this. They decided that 102 is the number of ideas in the world, or at least in the Western world. And so they have them here, from angel to world, and sort of in between is aristocracy, art, beauty, virtue, wisdom, big ideas, right? And they have these card catalogs that they use to do this, which is each card sort of had a reference to all the books where that idea existed, or the important mentions. It took them 7 years, 50 indexers, 75 clerical staff. It really blew the budget of this great books project. It was sort of a problem for Britannica at the time. And as you can imagine, after they did this great books and great ideas, there was a great critique that came. Of course, educators are famous for critiquing each other. Here, maybe rightly so. One of the big critiques was that, they selected the great books. And it was really based in one tradition, this sort of Western world idea. And it was, as I say, 12 men sitting in a room. There were a lot of things that were missing from the books and from the ideas that were in those books. They didn't have the notion of equality, civil rights, and other things. And there was basically no, all of these authors of all these books were white males until about the 90s, when the 3rd edition came out, and then some women were added and some minorities were added. So, clearly there was some criticism that they're not our great ideas. And, my criticism is, well, it's not, not my books either. I'm not reading Plato every day. But, I'm reading for economics, and I'm reading Noam Chomsky for beginners. And how could we do this stuff that Mortimer Adler was doing in the Syntopicon for my books? So our approach, building on this idea of we've mined the quotations, is we use the quotations to represent the popular ideas. And we use what we call the popular terms near the quotes as labels. So we think of the quotations as the text, and the words before and after the quotations are the context. And those are key for doing this. So here's an example. Here's a quote, Justice Stevens' opinion in this Bush v. Gore Supreme Court case that has about 81 instances the last time I looked. And although we may never know with complete certainty the identity of the winner of this year's presidential election, the identity of the loser is perfectly clear. It is the nation's confidence in the judge as an impartial guardian of the law. So this quote appears in 81 books here, and we look at the context of the quote. And we pull out words that sort of repeat in the context. And basically what we're doing here is the people who quote are labeling this quote with some terms. And it's basically a wisdom of the crowds or a voting effect. If you see Justice John Paul Stevens enough, you say, oh, that is probably some kind of label or relation to this quote. We don't actually know what the meaning of John Paul Stevens is, but we know that it somehow is related. So this is what we did. Without editors, without those 12 men sitting in a room, just our 2,000 or 4,000 computers sitting in a data center, we tried to have the ideas emerge and the labels and connections between those ideas emerge. So this is the user interface that we developed internally. This isn't launched. And one way we evaluated it was we just took a key term that wasn't really a great idea, like virtue, but we thought had some associated quotations and concepts, and that word was space race. And what we see here is you type in space race, you get a list of quotes that are related to space race. In other words, people, when they use this quote, they have some context for that quote that often has the word space race. When you look at a particular quote, you can see related key terms. So you can sort of pivot from space race to Apollo 11 or Buzz Aldrin. This is one book. And we can also do this kind of pivoting across all the books. So these are more general terms that appear via co-occurrence. So you might see here space race and Cold War might not appear in any one of these, but Cold War does appear here. There's a relationship between those two. And just let me give you a caveat that why we didn't launch this. There's still a lot of work to be done. We have a number of problems. I don't know if anyone noticed this, but it says that's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind, and it was first published in 1868. And yes, so I don't know, conspiracy theories aside, it's probably not true. and this is a metadata problem. So each book in our collection has some metadata, like publication date, author, et cetera. And some of the metadata is a little bit funky, like you might have a periodical or a serial, like Scientific American or National Geographic, or a series of poetry. And we basically found that it's always been labeled with the date of the first edition, first volume, first edition. So when we sort of found this, then we went to our metadata people, and they said, oh yeah, we know about that, we're fixing it. So these are kinds of things that pop up. The other is that our key term extractor was not so great. We have John F. and President John, sort of all variations. Just because key term extractors are really using statistical methods, and statistical methods sort of break down in our particular niche style of doing this extraction. So I want to point out that what's going on here when we have these labels and we have these longer descriptions is you can sort of look at a label and follow the connection. So what I did here was I took our system and I typed in Stanley Milgram as a key term, and then I saw the co-occurring key terms for that. And I think I did this maybe twice and picked out a few that were interesting. So Stanley Milgram, who was a famous social scientist at Yale in the 60s who did the 6 degrees of separations research. He was a cultural anthropologist. He wrote on the Holocaust. He had a collaborator, Irving Goffman. These are all sort of things that you might find related to, I don't know, the concept of Stanley Milgram or Stanley Milgram's writings and his work. So you can see here that you have a pretty good way of looking at co-occurring terms based on this common text that is being used across books. So I want to point out that what we're doing with mining quotations and what we're doing with mining the terms in the context of the quotations is really kind of a smart crowd effect. So there's two types, or at least people talk about two types of collective intelligence that's out there. One is the style that is being used for the Wikipedia, where a lot of people collaborate together on an article. And then there's this other style, crowd wisdom, where a lot of people independently are doing something, and you can sort of compute over that and come up with some greater answer, greater intelligence. So James Surowiecki, who wrote this book, Wisdom of the Crowd, sort of defines it as the community needs to be diverse, decentralized, needs a way of summarizing the opinions, and we have both in the quotations. We can find pieces of text that are being most quoted, so that's the way we can summarize. They're independent. These authors didn't talk to each other. And basically, what we're doing here is we're letting the authors themselves, who copy text from one piece to another, define what's important, and we're letting the authors who introduce quotations define how to label them. And so very much we're doing this smart crowds. So let me just mention, in closing, I have related work and a future work. Very much this work has been influenced by the history of hypertext, in particular Ted Nelson's notion of transclusion. So this was an early form of linking. Ted Nelson had the idea that you could take pieces of documents and connect them. Now, he had this idea that you would do this while you're authoring the document. You would actually sort of be typing a document and maybe find another document that you wanted to include, and you'd do something with a concept called an edit change list. Now, it was a very authoring model. In our case, what we did was we basically data mined this transclusion network. Ted Nelson came to Google, gave a talk. We had many meetings with him about this. So we're a fan of his. I should mention in future work, what we've done is really traded these 12 men in a room for an entire library and the ideas that come out of that library. But that library is actually aggregated over many different sources, 23 partner libraries and publishers and et cetera. And it's actually interesting to start asking the question, how can we take cuts or subsets of this huge digital library and look at the ideas that emerge and the differences of the ideas that emerge from that? So one cut you could take is a time-based cut and see what's happening in time. Now, this isn't ideas here. This is the history of, America. But you can ask the question, what ideas grew in popularity over time and then sort of decayed in popularity? Or can we compare, the Vatican Library to the Berkeley Humanities Library? I expect there's some differences in the ideas that come out of those two. Or you could look at, the geography of the ideas. We have the locations for the publications of the books. We know which countries they were written in, where they were published, so we can ask the various cultures. So these are the kinds of things, once we have this collection, you can start taking cuts and asking interesting questions about the evolution. So in conclusion, what we've been doing here is mining quotations for a couple of different purposes: for linking interesting information, for finding information in books, and also for exposing these repeated ideas and for navigating the ideas. So it's, Google's mantra is to organize the world's information and make it accessible and useful. And this seems like a good way of taking that ocean of text and turning it into something more. So I should say that I'm a researcher in the research group. I worked with researchers in the product group to do this, and it's sort of a unique characteristic of Google that you go do that. You have these massive data sets that aren't available anywhere else. And if you're interested in finding out more, we have 2 papers that are online on my webpage. My last name is very googly. Like, I don't have many doppelgangers at all, or Google gangers. So go and find my last name, look at the publications page. We have one paper published on this key ideas notion and one published on the linking and the generative hypertext. So thank you very much. So questions?
A little while ago, you made a comment about the important properties of the process. One you said was that the pieces of data be independent. The way you put it, right?
Yeah.
It seemed to me that what was going on in your process is that the evaluation of each of the pieces of data is independent. In fact, you were looking for dependencies,
Yes.
correlations, and relations. That's not visible. You can't know whether the data is dependent or independent.
Yeah.
You may derive that, but you can't know ahead.
Yeah. So the question was about the independence of the data or what is that about? And when James Surowiecki sort of characterized this, he was talking more about the people. He said, well, we read it, people in the crowd need to be independent, so they pay attention mostly to their own information. They're sort of making independent judgments about what's important. And it's that you're trying to aggregate. But they actually sort of settle on things that are dependent. They are sort of related. That's the key, right? They're pulling out stuff right? So they're voting with their pens, basically. Yeah.
So without being too proprietary of a question, how much of your work is influenced by bioinformatics now and ongoing? It seems like many of the techniques you're doing are bioinformatics, sequence similarity co-occurrence.
Right. So, so basically, I spent a long time looking for algorithms to do this because I don't like writing algorithms. And, and it turns out that we could not find any algorithms that work on this size data set. So we're certainly influenced very much by the bioinformatics algorithms, including, basically these algorithms try and find a common piece and then expand from there. So I think you can see a relationship with what we're doing and that. It turns out that our data set is much, much larger than the DNA data sets. Interestingly enough, I always thought DNA was huge. And their data sets are much, much noisier than our data sets. So the DNA motif or repeat discovery is really about trying to find the protein binding sites on molecule chains. And as you can see here, it's a lot more statistical in what they're doing. So we have some errors, but we actually don't have, this kind of statistical problem. Yeah.
Recently, Google got accused of making the world stupid, as you know.
Mm-hmm.
And I just wonder, with regard to that, whether, this kind of, the development of this kind of basis just along the lines of summarizing all of human knowledge and very sophisticated ideas so that a book, which may require a complete read to even fully, to begin to understand the concepts of the author, gets reduced to popularly ranked, whoever's the ranker, snippets of concepts. And is that something you think about?
Oh, that wasn't our intent. Our intent was not to make the world stupider. But yeah, obviously. I think that the world with access to information, easy search, sort of has, people tend to do a lot of navigation around. Maybe they don't read as long or as deeply. And I see this as a way of, when you're reading a secondary source, to jump into the primary source and really find out what that meant. So it really allows a deeper kind of investigation. Or if you're reading a primary source, you don't quite understand what this is about, to read an analysis. I don't see that is really causing too much fragmentation in the thought process. It's more like Vannevar Bush's following trails. You're still on a topic, you're still on a theme, but you happen to be moving from work to work. That's what syntopicon and syntopical reading is about. It's taking an idea or a theme and reading across many different sources at once, and that's what this gives you the power to do.
From a technical point of view, how much does the success of this technique depend upon the quotes or excerpts having a well-defined beginning and end versus things that kind of, I might leave a few words in and you might take them out.
Yeah.
They get kind of fuzzy with the actual.
Yeah. Good question. So it's about the beginning and the ends, and basically the fuzziness. And it's actually turned into one of the harder problems is getting those beginning and ends. And you see here, this quote doesn't quite begin at the beginning. So it turns out that as long as you have like a big enough segment of a quote, you could sort of say it's a quote without actually knowing its beginning. And I do this kind of processing, which is analogous to Manhattan skyline. So if we have a lot of versions of the quote, you can sort of look at which are the most frequent pieces of the quote and sort of say, well, it jumps up here, so this is almost like the most frequently used first sentence. But definitely it's an issue trying to find where a quote begins and ends, especially as people introduce them differently and split them up. And if we have enough versions of the quote, like if you have a couple of hundred, and a lot of quotes do have a couple of hundred, then you can use statistical methods to look at those and start counting up the frequency of the words within. Yes?
I'm curious, have you done a comparison at all between the appearance of attributed quotes versus unattributed quotes? It's called the Biden test.
Yeah. The plagiarism question. So no.
Not necessarily, but have you done a comparison?
No. So I think the way to do that is to use human evaluators. It's sort of hard to, maybe, I don't know, but I think it's hard to come up with an algorithm to see whether a quote is properly attributed. But we did stumble across, of course, a number of unattributed quotations and outright, plagiarism, whole sections of books. So, one of the things we'd like to do is you treat the context of the quote a little bit more intelligently and sort of look for basically correct attribution and maybe even sentiment. So you can actually have some more knowledge about how this quote is being used. Yes?
So going along with PageRank, do you do any kind of weighting by so if someone refers to something, what is that source's rank, or every vote is kind of counted equally? Also by domains, if some idea or quotation is referred in different domains, in biology and politics versus constantly. So you have this concept of diffusion, so is diffusion just across like a few entities, or is it?
So we only do stupid stuff right now. So basically, trying to get from beginning to end. PageRank is a great idea. Analyzing this network, basically, is a great idea, and we'd love to do that. It says a lot that these quotes, basically which quotes are in a book, which other quotes are in a book. You know that the books are related because they share some quotes, and so you have a whole network of quotation, like co-occurring links, and you can basically run something like PageRank across that, and maybe out would emerge the most important quote in the world, right? Yeah.
I think the partial automatic process for attribution, if you would associate anonymous author for each instance of a quote, where it's out of, and then look for the instance of the other authors
Yeah.
in that group nearby in that
Yes.
in the quote, that's an indication, a positive indication of attribution.
Yeah.
To really do it, you need human help.
Yeah, well, attribution is actually something that is computable, I believe. And we had a volunteer working with us to try and do attribution. We're trying to do this across 100 languages, so we can't look for speech acts like Nixon wrote. But we did have a few good statistical techniques for attribution to pop up, things like you mentioned. Co-occurrence of the name, right? Yeah, even just getting a good list of names across languages is tough. So it's amazing, but yeah.
It'd be interesting to mine the web for book quotations and then trend to that and see if you have an effect.
And so what was the?
If this causes a rise in book quotations.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so there's a long cycle here on people writing books, right?
No, to see if you have an influence on the web quoting more books
Oh, okay.
through the deployment of this tool.
Yeah. We actually have another technique for people to take book pieces and put them into web pages, which is another type of quotation. So when you visit the site, if you visit a public domain book, you can actually pull out images. So there's someone in the back there.
Applying this to scientific databases, it sounds mostly like you've been concentrating on non-scientific books.
Yeah. So scientific
maybe
database tends.
patents might be an example.
Yeah, or We actually have another product called scholar.google.com, which indexes scientific papers. Those tend to have a lot of citations already in them. And so, yeah, so what we find is that in scientific papers, not always, but often, they're using sort of the citation and citation reference to do the linking rather than copying big blocks. So, we sort of see it as an analogous way of doing linking, but there are different styles that authors use. What do you think?
You quoted that 88% of the automatically extracted quotes coincide with well-defined human interpreted quotes.
It wasn't quite that, but yeah. So. Is there a question?
Clarify, basically, are those all the quotes in the book, or are they basically missing? And do you have an idea about
So what we did there was we basically we had millions of quotations, and we wanted to know, and we have a rank list of them basically for every book. We wanted to know the ones that had a high score. Are those really good things to show users? Are those really look like a quotation? Or is it, the table of logarithms? So what we did was basically you take some from the high scoring set and some from the low scoring set, and you show these to users, and you don't tell them which is which, and you ask them to rate on a Likert scale, from 0 to 5, from awful to great. You ask them to rate, does this seem like a quote to you? And we had a little, short definition of what a quote is, memorable, historical, meaningful. And basically, when these human raters looked at something that we rated highly, they also rated it highly. And when they looked at something that we rated low, they also rated it low. So that was the evaluation that we were doing. We wanted to validate our ranking method.
The number of extractions per book, let's say the content that's in the book. You didn't say basically 88% of the content of this book is extracted from quotes. That was
No, but there is a related kind of metric which is called coverage, which is basically asking, I can't find it now, which is basically asking how many books in the corpus have quotations in them. This is sort of, the idea there is you want to say, well, this, if you're going to generate links between books, it's nice to have lots of books that have this feature. So what we found is that a large number, I didn't quite remember what it was, but a large number of books had quotations, larger than any of the other styles that currently exist for creating links. Yeah.
Can you elaborate on some of the issues in making it incremental? The technical issues, I assume?
Yeah, so we have this database of quotations, and you toss a new book in, and you shingle it, and you sequence it. And as long as you've seen a quote before, it'll work, it'll fall into it. But if that book contains the second instance of a quote, you've already thrown out all the non-quote data from your data set in processing phases. So if you do that too much over time, basically you're going to start missing quotes. So that's the main problem is, probably we need to, as I said, this is multi-phases. I think there's like 7 or 8 phases that are going on here. We need to sort of maintain data further into the pipeline in order to do this incremental. Turns out that it's just easier, spend another 24 hours and regenerate it in our minds.
So maybe one more question.
Okay.
I was going to ask, can you detect quotes that have been translated into other languages? I mean, probably the shingle technique might not work, but there's a lot about the challenge.
Yeah, so you can detect, books that are non-English. You can detect quotes in those, obviously. You can detect books that are in, let's say, French books that have English quotes and English books that have French quotes. But you can't correlate the translations. Like this is the version in English and this is the version in French. That's hard.
But you could run Google Translate.
I can run Google Translate. But actually, since we're talking about language, I do have a funny slide. Just I want to point out, what happens